I shouldn't have called him, but my reflection didn't look like someone who had options left. It looked like someone rehearsing a smile she couldn't hold, standing under the soft gold lights of my sister's wedding while the music swelled too loudly and the room spun just enough to make breathing feel like work. My fingers pressed against the edge of the marble sink in the restroom as I tried to steady them, tried to fix the line of my lipstick for the third time in 5 minutes, tried to ignore the faint shadow beneath my sleeve that no amount of foundation could completely erase, because tonight wasn't supposed to be about me, it was about her, about white roses and champagne and the kind of happiness that people take pictures of and frame. But every time I closed my eyes I could still feel the echo of a voice too close to my ear, too controlled to be kind, telling me to behave, to smile, to remember where I belonged. And I did smile when I stepped back into the hallway. I smiled at guests I barely knew, at relatives who commented on how grown up I looked, how beautiful everything was, how lucky my sister must feel, and I nodded like I agreed, like I wasn't counting the seconds between breaths, like I wasn't measuring the distance to the nearest exit, like I wasn't thinking about the way my phone felt heavier than usual in my hand. Because there was a name sitting at the top of my contacts that I hadn't touched in months, a name that didn't belong in a place like this, a name that came with silence and decisions and consequences I didn't fully understand, Victor Moretti, and I told myself I wouldn't do it. I told myself I could get through one night, just one, but then I caught my reflection again in the glass of a framed photograph hanging in the corridor, saw the way my shoulders curved inward like I was trying to disappear inside a dress that didn't belong to me, saw the way my eyes kept searching for something that wasn't there, and something inside me shifted, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and final, like a door closing somewhere deep inside my chest, and before I could think myself out of it I unlocked my phone, my thumb hovering for a second too long over his name before pressing call. The line rang once, twice, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer, that I'd made a mistake I couldn't take back, but then the silence on the other end changed, subtle but unmistakable, like a room going still, and when he spoke his voice was exactly the way I remembered, low, controlled, not asking questions he didn't need to ask. And suddenly all the words I had prepared disappeared, leaving only the truth that slipped out before I could stop it. "Can you come get me?" I whispered, barely louder than my own breath, and there was a pause, not hesitation, just a measured second that felt longer than it should have, before he replied, calm and certain in a way that made something in my chest unclench for the first time all night, "Stay where you are," and the line went quiet. And I stood there in the middle of a perfect wedding with my heart finally beating for a different reason, not fear, not obligation, but something unfamiliar, something dangerous in its own way, something that felt like the beginning of a choice I couldn't undo. I stayed exactly where I was, even after the call ended, even after the screen went dark in my hand, because something in his voice had not sounded like a suggestion, it had sounded like a certainty, and for the first time that night I did not feel the need to run, which should have scared me more than anything else, but instead it felt like standing still after hours of being chased by something no one else could see. The music from the ballroom drifting down the hallway in soft waves. Laughter rising and falling like nothing in the world was wrong, like people did not hide entire lives behind practiced smiles and carefully chosen words, and I tried to blend back into it, I really did, stepping through the double doors with my shoulders straight and my expression fixed, because I had learned how to survive rooms like this by becoming invisible in plain sight, by laughing when expected, by nodding at the right moments, by pretending that the tightness in my chest was just excitement and not something heavier pressing down on my ribs. But the second I stepped onto the polished floor I felt it again, that awareness, that quiet shift in the air when someone was watching too closely, and I did not need to turn to know who it was. His presence always came before him, subtle but undeniable, like a shadow that stretched further than it should, and when I finally looked, he was already there near the edge of the room, not interrupting, not announcing himself, just standing with a stillness that made everyone else seem louder by comparison, his suit dark and perfectly tailored, his posture relaxed in a way that was not casual but controlled, and people moved around him without realizing why they were giving him space, like instinct was guiding them away from something they could not name. And for a second I forgot how to breathe because he did not belong here, not in a place filled with soft colors and polite conversations, not under chandeliers meant for celebration. But he did not look out of place either, he looked like he owned the quiet. Between every sound, like the room had adjusted itself to him without permission, and then his eyes found mine, direct and unwavering, not searching, not questioning, just confirming, like he had already known exactly where I would be, and something inside me tightened and loosened at the same time, because I realized in that moment that calling him had not been a risk, it had been a decision, and decisions had consequences, and I did not know what mine would be yet, but I could feel them. Getting closer with every step he took toward me, slow, measured, deliberate, until the space between us disappeared and the noise of the room seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant, and he did not touch me, did not reach out, did not ask what happened, he just looked, his gaze moving briefly from my face to the way my sleeve shifted when I adjusted it, to the tension in my shoulders that I had tried so hard to hide, and I felt seen in a way that was not gentle but not unkind either, just precise, like he was reading a language I had never spoken out loud, and when he finally spoke his voice was low enough that only I could hear it, steady and calm in a way that made everything else feel louder by contrast. "You should not be here," he said, not as a question, not even as a judgment, just a statement of fact, and I swallowed, forcing myself to hold his gaze even though it felt like standing too close to something powerful and unfamiliar. "I know," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended, and for a brief second something shifted in his expression, not softening, not quite, but something less distant, something that made the next words land heavier than they should have. "Then you are leaving," he said, as if it had already been decided, as if the version of me that stayed was no longer an option, and I realized with a clarity that felt almost terrifying that I believed him, not because I had to, not because I was afraid, but because for the first time in a long time, leaving felt possible. I did not move right away, even after he said it, even after the certainty in his voice settled over me like something final, because leaving was never just about walking out of a room, it was about everything that came after, the questions, the consequences, the way people would look at me when they realized I was gone before the last toast, before the last dance, and I felt it again, that hesitation creeping in like it always did, quiet and convincing, telling me to stay, to endure, to make it through just one more hour, just one more night. But then I felt a hand brush lightly against my elbow, not gripping, not forcing, just there, a presence that did not ask but did not need to, and I turned slightly to see him closer now, close enough that I could catch the faint scent of something clean and expensive, something that did not belong in a room filled with champagne and perfume, something steadier, like him. And the contact lasted only a second before he let go, but it was enough to ground me, enough to remind me that I had already made the call, already stepped across a line I could not pretend did not exist, and when I lifted my eyes again I saw movement behind him, subtle but coordinated, men I had not noticed before now positioning themselves near the exits, not blocking, not obvious, just present in a way that shifted the balance of the room without anyone realizing why, and it was then that I felt it, the change, the quiet ripple of tension that moved through the space like a draft no one could quite place, and I knew before I turned who would be standing there, too close, too familiar, the kind of presence that made my shoulders tighten without permission, his voice low and controlled as it reached me from behind. "Where have you been?" he asked, not loudly, not angrily, just enough to make it clear that the question was not optional, and I felt my breath catch for a fraction of a second before I forced it steady, forced myself not to shrink, not to step back the way I used to, because something had shifted inside me the moment I made that call, something small but unbreakable, and when I turned to face him I did not look down, did not apologize, did not explain, I just held his gaze, even as my pulse hammered in my ears, even as every instinct told me to make this easier, to smooth it over, to pretend everything was fine, but nothing was fine, and for the first time I did not try to hide it, and I saw the flicker of surprise in his expression, brief but real, like he was seeing something he had not expected, something he did not quite understand, and before he could say anything else, before the moment could tip back into something familiar and suffocating, Victor stepped forward, not abrupt, not aggressive, just enough to place himself between us without making a scene, his presence quiet but absolute, and the space shifted again, the air tightening in a way that made the conversation around us fade into something distant, and for a second no one spoke, not because they could not, but because something in him made silence feel like the only correct response, and when he finally did speak his tone was calm, almost polite, but there was something underneath it that carried weight. Something that did not need to be explained to be understood. "She is leaving," he said, simple and direct, not looking at me, not asking for confirmation, just stating what was already true, and I felt it then, the moment where everything could have gone one way or another, where I could have stepped back into the version of myself that stayed, that endured, that made excuses, but instead I took a breath, steady and deliberate, and stepped forward, not away from him, not toward anyone else, just forward, choosing motion over stillness, choosing something different, and for the first time that night, I did not feel like I was escaping, I felt like I was walking out on my own terms. I felt the room fall behind me with every step I took, not in sound because the music still played and glasses still clinked and someone laughed too loudly near the bar, but in meaning, like I was no longer part of it, like whatever version of me had belonged in that room was still standing there smiling while I moved forward without her, and for a second I expected something to stop me, a hand on my arm, a voice calling my name, something familiar and binding, but nothing came, only the quiet awareness of Victor walking beside me, not rushing, not guiding, just there in a way that made the path ahead feel clearer than it had all night, and I focused on small things to keep myself steady, the rhythm of my heels against the polished floor, the cool air shifting as we passed through the open doors, the faint scent of night waiting outside the venue, because if I thought too far ahead I knew I would hesitate. I knew I would start questioning everything I had just done, and I could not afford that now, not when the hardest part had already been choosing to move, and when we reached the edge of the ballroom I heard it, my name, sharper this time, closer, and I closed my eyes for half a second before turning, because I knew I could not leave without facing it, not completely, not yet, and there he was again, standing just a few steps behind us, his expression no longer controlled in the same way, something tighter around the edges, something that did not like losing control of a situation it thought it understood, and for a moment the air between us felt like it used to, heavy, expectant, waiting for me to respond the way I always had, but I did not step back this time, I did not fill the silence with apologies or explanations, I just stood there, steady in a way that felt unfamiliar but right, and I saw it again, that flicker of something in his eyes, confusion maybe, or disbelief, like he was trying to reconcile this version of me with the one he thought he knew, and before he could speak, before the moment could stretch into something else, Victor shifted slightly, not blocking the view, not confronting, just enough to remind everyone exactly where he stood, and the change was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like the air had been recalibrated around him, and I watched as the tension that had been directed at me found a new center, not aggressive, not explosive, just redirected in a way that made the space feel different, and Victor did not raise his voice, did not step forward, did not do anything that could be called dramatic, he simply met the other man's gaze with a calm that carried weight, the kind of calm that did not need to prove itself, and for a long second no one moved, no one spoke, until Victor finally said, his tone even and unhurried, "This is not your moment," and the words landed quietly but firmly, not an argument, not a challenge, just a boundary drawn with absolute clarity, and something in the way he said it made it clear that crossing it would not be wise, and I felt my breath release slowly, a tension I had been holding for so long finally easing without me realizing it. And when I looked back at Victor he did not wait for a response, did not check if I was ready, he simply turned toward the exit. As if the decision had already been made, as if the next step was the only step left, and this time I did not hesitate, I followed, not because I was being led, but because I had already chosen to leave, and as the doors opened and the night air met my skin, cool and real and nothing like the controlled atmosphere inside, I realized something I had not allowed myself to think before, that leaving was not the end of something, it was the beginning of something I did not fully understand yet. Something uncertain and unfamiliar, but for the first time in a long time, it did not feel like fear, it felt like possibility. The night air hit me sharper than I expected, cool against my skin, carrying the distant hum of traffic and something quieter underneath, something steady that felt nothing like the noise I had just left behind, and I stopped just outside the venue doors without meaning to, like my body needed a second to understand that I had actually stepped out, that no one had pulled me back, that the world had not collapsed because I chose to leave, and for a moment I just stood there, breathing in slowly, letting the air fill my lungs in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, like I had been holding my breath for longer than I realized, and beside me Victor did not rush me, did not speak, he simply waited with the same quiet patience he carried into every room, his presence grounding without pressing, and I became aware of a car pulling up along the curb, dark and clean, the kind that did not need attention but always received it anyway, the driver stepping out with a subtle nod before opening the back door, and everything about the moment felt precise, intentional, like each piece had been placed exactly where it needed to be, and I hesitated again, not out of fear this time but out of something else, something quieter, the realization that stepping into that car meant more than just leaving the building behind, it meant accepting what came next, whatever that was, and I glanced at Victor, searching for something I could not quite name, reassurance maybe, or permission, but he did not offer either, he only met my gaze with that same steady look that never forced, never demanded, and in that silence I understood that this choice was still mine, even now, even with everything that had already happened, and I exhaled slowly before stepping forward, the soft leather seat cool beneath my hands as I slid inside, the door closing with a muted sound that felt final in a way I could not ignore, and for a second I just sat there, my hands resting in my lap, my heart still adjusting to a rhythm that no longer felt trapped, and when Victor entered the car beside me the space shifted again, quieter, more contained, the outside world fading into something distant behind tinted glass, and the driver pulled away from the curb smoothly, the venue lights receding in the reflection of the window as we moved, and I watched them disappear, that bright, perfect image of celebration growing smaller until it was nothing more than a blur of gold and white, and I did not feel regret the way I thought I would. I did not feel the pull to go back or explain or fix anything, I only felt the absence of something that had been there for too long, like a weight I had carried without realizing how heavy it was until it was gone, and the silence inside the car stretched, not uncomfortable, just present, until Victor finally spoke, his voice low and even. "You did not call me for a ride," he said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what he already knew. And I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly in my lap as I searched for the right words, but there were none that felt complete enough, none that could explain the way everything had built up to that single moment. So I said the only thing that felt true, I did not know who else to call, and the admission hung in the air between us, honest and unpolished, and he studied me for a brief second before nodding once, as if that was enough, as if he did not need anything more, and something in my chest loosened again. Because he was not asking me to justify it, not asking me to explain myself in ways I was used to, he was simply accepting that I had reached out, and after a moment he added, quieter this time, "Then you called the right person, and I did not know why." Those words settled so deeply, why they made the space inside me feel steadier than it had all night, but they did, and as the city lights moved past the window in soft streaks of color, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not thinking about what I was leaving behind, I was thinking about where I was going. I kept watching the city lights blur past the window as if I could memorize the exact moment my life shifted into something else, each street lamp stretching into soft lines of gold against the glass, each passing car just another reminder that the world kept moving whether I was ready or not. And I realized I had no idea where we were going, not really, because I had not asked, and he had not told me. And under normal circumstances that would have unsettled me, would have made my thoughts spiral into every possible outcome, but instead there was a strange calm settling in, quiet and unfamiliar, like I had stepped into a space where I was not expected to anticipate every reaction or prepare for every response. And I became aware of my own posture slowly changing, my shoulders no longer drawn in, my hands no longer clenched tightly in my lap, my breathing steadying in a way that felt almost foreign. And I did not know if that was because of him or because I had finally removed myself from something that had been holding me in place for too long, maybe both, and the silence in the car stretched again, but this time it felt different, less like waiting and more like space, space I did not have to fill, space I did not have to explain, until my voice broke it without me planning to speak. "Where are we going?" I asked quietly, not demanding, not afraid, just needing to understand the direction of something I had already chosen, and he turned his head slightly toward me, his expression unchanged but attentive in a way that made me feel like the question mattered, like I mattered in this moment. "Somewhere you can breathe," he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because it was not an address, not a location, it was a purpose, and I let that settle for a second before nodding, because it was enough, more than enough, and we drove in silence after that, the kind that did not press or demand, just existed between two people who did not need to fill every second with words, and after what felt like both minutes and hours the car slowed, turning onto a quieter street lined with tall trees and low lighting, the kind of neighborhood that felt removed from everything else, like it existed on its own terms, and when the car finally came to a stop I hesitated again, not out of doubt but out of awareness, because this was another threshold, another step into something I did not fully understand yet, and Victor stepped out first, the door opening with a soft sound before he turned slightly, giving me space but not distance, and I followed, my heels quieter now against the smooth pavement, the night air cooler here, calmer, and I looked up to see a large house set back from the street, its windows lit warmly, not extravagant in the way I expected but precise, controlled, like everything else about him, and I stood there for a second taking it in, trying to reconcile the image with the man beside me, trying to understand what part of him this place represented, and before I could ask he spoke again, his voice lower now, almost reflective, "You are safe here," and the words settled deeper than I expected, because they were not dramatic, not emphasized, just stated as fact, and I realized then that safety had never been something I heard spoken so simply, without condition, without expectation, just given, and I felt something shift inside me again, something small but steady, and I nodded once, more to myself than to him, before stepping forward toward the door, not because I was told to, not because I had to, but because for the first time in a long time, I was choosing where I went next. I stood just inside the doorway for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the warmth of the interior light, because everything here felt different from the world I had just left, quieter, steadier, like the air itself had been softened, and I noticed things in pieces first, the clean lines of the hallway, the muted colors, the absence of noise that never seemed to fully disappear in public spaces, and I realized how much tension I had been carrying without even naming it, because my shoulders were still slightly raised, my breathing still careful, as if I was waiting for something to interrupt this calm, but nothing did, and Victor closed the door behind us without urgency, the sound final but not heavy, and he moved past me without saying anything, not rushing, not guiding, just leading in a way that felt natural, and I followed because there was no reason not to, because nothing here asked me to explain myself, and as we walked deeper into the house I noticed how empty it was in a deliberate way, not lacking life but arranged like life had been given space to exist without clutter, and I wondered briefly if he lived here alone, or if solitude was simply part of how he chose to move through the world, and the thought did not feel intrusive, just observational, like I was learning a language without needing to speak it yet, and when we reached a softly lit living space he finally stopped, turning slightly toward me, and for the first time since I had met him his expression felt less like a shield and more like something measured, something aware, and he said nothing for a moment, as if allowing me to settle into the space before anything else was asked of me, and I found myself sitting carefully on the edge of a chair without being told, my hands still folded loosely in my lap, unsure of what came next, unsure of what I was supposed to do with this silence that did not feel empty, only unfamiliar, and after a few seconds he spoke, his voice calm and steady, "No one will follow you here," and I looked up at that, because the certainty in his tone was not a promise, it was a fact, and something in me reacted to that more deeply than I expected, because I had spent so much of my life adjusting to unpredictability that certainty felt almost unreal, and I nodded slowly without realizing I was doing it, and then I hesitated before speaking, my voice quieter than usual but steady enough to carry. "I did not know I needed somewhere like this," I admitted, and the words felt honest in a way I was not used to expressing out loud, and he regarded me for a moment before replying, "Most people do not realize it until they have nowhere left to stand," and I let that sit between us without trying to respond immediately, because there was something in it that felt too true to rush past, and instead I looked down at my hands, noticing for the first time how they were not shaking anymore, and that realization alone felt like a shift I could not ignore, and after a moment I asked, not out of fear but out of curiosity that had finally replaced it, "What happens now?" And he did not answer right away, not because he was avoiding it, but because he seemed to consider the question in a way that felt intentional, and when he finally spoke his voice was lower, steady in the same way everything about him seemed steady. "Now you stop surviving," he said simply, and I felt the weight of that statement in a way I could not immediately define, because survival had been the only constant I had ever known, and the idea of stopping it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a question I had never been allowed to ask myself before, and for the first time since I made that call, I did not feel like I was running towards something uncertain. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something I might finally be allowed to choose. I did not realize how quiet a place could feel until I heard myself breathe inside it, not the sharp controlled breathing I had grown used to in crowded rooms, but something slower, something that did not feel like I was preparing for impact. And I stood in the center of the living space for a moment without moving, noticing how the silence here did not pressure me, it simply existed, and Victor was no longer beside me, though I could sense he was nearby, not watching in a way that felt invasive, but present in the way someone becomes part of the environment without needing to announce themselves. And I slowly walked a few steps further into the room, my fingers brushing lightly against the back of a chair as if to confirm that this place was real, that I was really here, and I thought about everything that had led me to this moment, the hallway, the call, the decision I had made without fully understanding what it would change, and now that I was here, in a place that did not demand anything from me, I felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest, not fear, not urgency, but awareness, and I sat down again, this time more fully, allowing myself to settle instead of hover. And I noticed how my body responded differently when it was not waiting for the next disruption, my shoulders lowering without instruction, my hands resting without tension, and I realized I had not felt this kind of stillness in years, maybe longer, and after a few moments Victor returned, holding a glass of water which he placed gently on the table in front of me before sitting across from me at a distance that felt deliberate, not distant, and he spoke after a brief pause, his voice even as always, "You do not have to explain anything tonight," and I looked at him then, really looked, noticing not just the control in his expression but the absence of demand behind it, as if he understood that explanations were something people offered when they were trying to survive rather than when they were trying to heal. And I found myself nodding again without realizing I was doing it, because no one had ever said that to me before, not once, and the idea of not having to justify my own decisions felt almost unreal, and I took a slow sip of water, feeling the coolness steady me in a way I did not expect, and after a long pause I asked quietly, "Why me?" Not as a challenge, not as doubt, but because the question had been sitting in me since the moment I made the call, and he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting slightly as if considering not just the words but what lay behind them, and when he finally spoke it was not with certainty, but with something more grounded than certainty. "Because you did not ask to be saved," he said, "you asked to be picked up," and I felt something in my chest tighten and release at the same time, because it was true in a way I had not known how to say. And for a long moment neither of us spoke again, and the silence between us did not feel heavy, it felt structured, like something new being built carefully without noise, and I looked around the room once more, noticing how nothing here rushed, nothing here demanded immediate response, and I realized slowly that what I had stepped into was not an escape from my life, but the first space I had ever been in where I might actually be allowed to rebuild it, and that thought did not frighten me the way it would have before, it steadied me, and for the first time since everything began, I did not feel like I was waiting for the next moment to survive. I felt like I had finally reached one where I could simply exist. I did not notice how long I had been sitting there until the silence stopped feeling unfamiliar and started feeling like something I could live inside, not empty, not heavy, just present, and at some point I realized the glass of water in front of me was half empty, my fingers no longer tense around it, my breathing no longer measured like I was waiting for something to break, and Victor had not spoken for a while, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be forced into the space between us, and that was the first time I understood what he meant when he said I did not have to explain anything tonight, because the absence of pressure itself was its own kind of language, and I found myself looking around the room again, noticing details I had missed before, the soft lighting along the walls, the way the furniture was arranged not for display but for use, the absence of anything unnecessary, and it struck me that everything here felt intentional, without being demanding, and I wondered if that was how he lived, or if this was simply what remained when everything else had been stripped away, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting my shoulders rest completely for the first time in what felt like years, and the realization came quietly, almost unexpectedly, that I was not bracing myself anymore, not waiting for a voice to interrupt, not anticipating a consequence for simply existing, and Victor finally stood after a long pause. Moving toward a window that overlooked the darkened street outside, his hands resting loosely at his sides, and he spoke without turning back, his voice calm in the way it always was, "You are not required to stay here in a way that feels like confinement," and I let the words settle before responding because they mattered in a way I did not want to rush, and when I finally spoke my voice was steadier than it had been all night. "It does not feel like confinement," I said, and I meant it, and that truth surprised me more than anything else that had happened, and he nodded once, as if that answer was enough, as if he had expected nothing more complicated than honesty, and I stood slowly after that, not because I was leaving, but because I wanted to move, to feel the space in a different way, and I walked toward the window beside him, stopping a few feet away, looking out at the quiet street below, and for a moment neither of us spoke again, and I thought about the version of myself that had existed just hours earlier, standing in a crowded room trying to disappear in plain sight, and how far that version felt now, not gone, but distant, like a life I had stepped out of rather than been pulled from, and I turned slightly toward Victor then, unsure of what I expected to see, but what I found was not an answer, not a judgment, just stillness, and I realized that for the first time I was not trying to interpret someone's intention in order to survive it, I was simply allowed to exist within it, and that understanding did not arrive with clarity or certainty, it arrived with something quieter, something steadier, like the beginning of trust before it has a name, and as the night stretched on around us, I finally understood that nothing about this moment was asking me to decide everything at once, it was only asking me to stay long enough to see what came next, and for the first time I did not feel like I was being carried by circumstances, I felt like I was standing inside a choice that belonged entirely to me.